Welcome, campers, to the place where the road never ends and the dark between the mile markers is deeper than it has any right to be. Pull up close tonight. This one comes from the highway. And once you hear it, you're going to think about it the next time your headlights are the only light left in the world. My name is Dale Pruitt. I've been driving truck since I was 23 years old, which means by the time any of this happened, I had logged somewhere north of 2 million miles across this country. I know the roads. I know the rhythms. I know the difference between tired eyes playing tricks and something that is genuinely, fundamentally wrong with the world around you. I need you to understand that before I tell you what happened on I-90 in eastern Montana on the night of November 14th, 2019, because if you don't understand that about me first, you're going to write this off as a man who fell asleep at the wheel and dreamed something strange. And I can tell you with every certainty I have left in me, which admittedly isn't as much as it used to be, that I was awake for every single second of what I'm about to describe. I grew up in Billings. That's important because it means I know eastern Montana the way some people know their own backyard. Not just the roads but the feel of them, the smell of the sage when the wind comes down off the rim rocks, the particular quality of silence that settles over the high plains after the last of the summer tourists have gone home and the land goes back to being what it actually is, which is vast and indifferent and old in a way that makes every human structure sitting on top of it look temporary. I know the way the sky presses down in November, heavy and close, the clouds moving fast from the northwest and carrying that dry metallic smell that means serious cold is coming. I know what the headlights do on that section of highway east of Billings, how they catch the frost on the dead grass along the shoulder and make it glitter like something almost beautiful. I know all of it. I grew up with it. I drove that exact stretch of I-90 as a teenager in my father's Ford, and I drove it 1,000 times as a working trucker before the night I'm telling you about. That familiarity is the thing that made what happened so difficult to process, because when the road you know better than almost anything in your life turns wrong on you, there isn't anything left to anchor yourself to. My rig was a 2016 Kenworth T680. Dark blue, though it looked black most of the time in low light. I'd been running that truck for 3 years by then and I knew every sound it made, every vibration, every quirk. It had a slight pull to the right that I'd learned to compensate for without thinking about it. The passenger seat heater didn't work and hadn't since the previous February when I'd spilled a large coffee directly into the control panel in a truck stop outside of Spokane, which was exactly as embarrassing as it sounds. The CB radio had a tendency to pick up faint station bleed from an AM country station out of Miles City if you were running east of Billings in certain weather conditions. And that night, with the atmosphere compressed the way it was, I could hear it clearly, tinny and distant, some old Waylon Jennings track cutting in and out under the static. I was carrying a full load of industrial heating equipment out of Missoula, bound for a distribution warehouse in Rapid City, South Dakota. The load was legitimate, the paperwork was clean, and the delivery window was the following morning at 8, which meant I needed to make time and I needed to stay sharp. I'd left Missoula at 11 that morning, taken my mandatory break outside of Bozeman where I ate a turkey sandwich from a gas station that I would not recommend to anyone under any circumstances. And by the time I was rolling east through Billings it was coming up on 7 in the evening and I was feeling solid. Not great. You're never truly great at our 8 of a drive, but functional. Alert. Present. My thermos was full of coffee I'd made fresh at the Pilot in Billings, and I remember thinking it was still hot enough to be useful as I pulled back onto the interstate heading east, the glow of the city fading in my mirrors and the darkness ahead opening up into that particular Montana emptiness that I had always found more settling than unsettling. I had a daughter named Cassie who was 11 at the time. I thought about her when I drove at night, not in a sad way, just in the way that fathers think about their kids when they're alone with a lot of road ahead of them. Her mother and I had separated 2 years before, amicably enough, and I had Cassie every other weekend and every Wednesday when the routes permitted. She liked horses and detective novels and a particular brand of orange candy that I could only ever find at one specific gas station in Hardin, which I made a point of stopping at whenever I was running that corridor. I had a bag of it in the cup holder. I'd picked it up on the westbound run 3 days prior, kept it for her. She was going to be irritated that I'd driven past Hardin without stopping to see her, but I'd texted her from Billings and she'd sent back a string of horse emojis that I chose to interpret as forgiveness. I'm telling you all of this because I want you to understand that I was a real person, living a real life, with real and specific things tethering me to the ordinary world. Cassie's orange candy in the cup holder, the broken passenger seat heater, the Waylon Jennings bleed on the CB. These details matter. They're the landmarks I was using to measure reality against when reality started doing what it did. At 7:43 p.m., approximately 11 miles east of Billings, I passed mile marker 312. I know it was 7:43 because I had the digital clock on the dash, and I had just glanced at it when my headlights caught the marker on the right shoulder. It was a standard green interstate marker, reflective white numbers, slightly tilted from what I assumed was a past impact from road debris or weather. Nothing remarkable. I'd passed it hundreds of times. There was a dead mule deer on the shoulder approximately 30 feet past the marker, which was not unusual. Deer collisions on that stretch were common enough that you almost stopped seeing them. This one was a doe, medium-sized, lying on her side with her legs extended toward the road, and she'd been there long enough that the ravens had been at her. The cavity of her torso darkened and opened. I registered it and moved on the way you move on from something you've seen 100 times. The fuel gauge read 7/8 full. The outside temperature on the dash display read 17 degrees Fahrenheit. The next 20 minutes were unremarkable. The highway ran straight and flat, the occasional set of oncoming headlights, the distant red blink of a communications tower to the south. I finished about a third of my thermos. Wayland faded into static and then came back. I was thinking about a scheduling issue I needed to sort out with dispatch the following week, something routine about a return load out of Rapid City, when my headlights swept across mile marker 312. I slowed instinctively. Then I told myself I'd miscounted, or misread, or simply wasn't paying attention. It happens. You zone out on a long stretch and lose track of where you are. I'd probably been running on habit and had confused the number. I noted the time, 8:09 p.m., and kept rolling. The dead doe was on the shoulder, 30 feet past the marker. Lying on her side, legs toward the road, ravens having done their work on the torso. Exactly as I'd seen her 26 minutes earlier. I pulled back on the throttle and felt the truck slow, my eyes moving between the deer and the mirror, and I watched the marker recede behind me in the red wash of my taillights. 312. There was no question. I picked up the CB handset. Any eastbound traffic on I-90 east of Billings? You copy? The static held for a moment, and then the Waylon Jennings track bled through, clearer than it had been before, and I set the handset down. I checked my mirrors, checked the fuel gauge, 3/4 full now, which was slightly lower than I'd have expected, but within the margin of a long grade I might have run harder than I realized, and I kept driving. I was looking for the next marker. 313. It came, and then 314, and I breathed out slowly. I told myself the first one must have been mislabeled, or I'd simply had a moment of road hypnosis, which is a real phenomenon, a dissociative state that long-haul drivers are trained to recognize and counter. I cranked the heat down 2 degrees, took a long swallow of coffee, and focused on the center line. At 8:41 p.m., I passed mile marker 312. There was no confusion this time. No rationalization immediately available. I'd watched the numbers climb, 315, 316, 317, and then the sequence had simply reset. 312, tilted slightly, reflective in my headlights, and 30 feet ahead the doe on the shoulder, and I heard myself say out loud, to no one, in a voice that was very controlled and very quiet, "That is not right." I pulled over. This is what I know about myself. I am not a man who panics. My ex-wife would tell you that this is both one of my best qualities and one of my most maddening ones. I pulled the Kenworth onto the shoulder, set the brake, turned on my hazards, and sat for a full 3 minutes with the engine running and my hands flat on my thighs, looking at the highway ahead of me through the windshield. The hazard lights pulsed orange across the asphalt in a slow, steady rhythm. Nothing moved on the road in either direction. The temperature display read 16 degrees. The fuel gauge read 2/3 full, and that was the detail that snagged in my mind, because I had started this run with a full tank and I had not driven far enough to account for a third of it gone. I took out my phone and opened the Maps application. No signal, which was not unusual in that corridor, but the absence felt different now, heavier. The way the absence of a sound you relied on feels heavier than regular silence. I got out of the truck. The cold hit me the way eastern Montana cold always hits you, immediately and without apology, reaching straight through the layers and touching your face first. The highway was dead quiet. No wind. No animal sounds. The kind of silence that isn't peaceful but is instead the silence of something waiting, the silence of held breath. I walked to the rear of the trailer and looked east down the highway, and I could see nothing beyond the reach of my running lights, just the road narrowing into darkness, the white lines vanishing into nothing, the sky above absolutely opaque with cloud cover, not a single star visible anywhere. I looked west. The same darkness. No glow from Billings, which should have been visible on the horizon. A faint ambient bloom the way any city leaves its mark on the sky around it. There was nothing. Just road and darkness and the amber pulse of my hazard lights against the asphalt. I stood there for what felt like 2 minutes but was probably 30 seconds. And then I got back in the truck because it was 17 below zero with wind chill, and standing on the shoulder of a Montana highway at night accomplishes nothing except accelerating the rate at which you become a problem for the next passing driver. I sat in the warmth and I thought about it carefully, methodically, the way my father taught me to approach things that didn't make immediate sense. You inventory what you know, you identify what you don't know, and you make a decision based on the best available information. What I knew, I had passed mile marker 312 3 times. What I didn't know, why? My decision, drive forward, count every marker, document the sequence, and trust that there would be a rational explanation that I was simply not seeing yet. I released the brake and pulled back onto the highway. For the next 47 minutes, the mile markers ran in sequence. I counted every one, said each number aloud in the cab, my voice low and steady in the darkness. 313, 314, 315, all the way to 338, and I exhaled, and I thought, misread, equipment anomaly, brain doing what brains do when they're tired and monotonous roads are all there is. I took a long drink of coffee. The Waylon track on the CB had been replaced by something I didn't recognize, a slower song with a steel guitar, sad in the way that only old country music can be sad, the kind of sadness that knows exactly what it is. The fuel gauge read just under half. Which was wrong. Which was significantly wrong for the distance I'd actually traveled. But I was working on rationalizing that too, a possible fuel leak, a gauge sensor issue, something mechanical and inexplicable, when at 9:38 p.m. my headlights swept across mile marker 312. The doe on the shoulder. The slightly tilted post. The darkness beyond. I didn't stop this time. I kept my speed exactly where it was, 62 miles per hour, and I watched the markers. 313 came. 314. The sequence held. I had my phone out on the dash and I was trying the Maps application every 30 seconds, watching for signal, getting nothing. I tried the CB again, repeated my call, eastbound traffic, anyone in the corridor, and the static answered me, and then the steel guitar bled through and I set the handset down and kept driving. Here is where I need to tell you about the coffee. When I'd poured the thermos in Billings, I'd done what I always do, filled it almost to the top, leaving just enough room to close the lid without spilling. By my estimate, I was somewhere in the range of 4 hours out of Billings, which would have put me closer to Forsyth than to any loop back to the city, and in 4 hours I typically drink most of a large thermos. What I found when I picked it up at around 9:50 p.m. was that it was still almost completely full. Hot. Fresh. As if I'd poured it perhaps 30 minutes ago. That was when the first real fear arrived. Not the animal fear, not yet, that came later, but the cognitive fear, the fear of a rational mind confronting evidence that the rational framework it depends on may not be adequate for the situation it's in. I set the thermos down carefully. I looked at the fuel gauge. I looked at the clock. I looked at the highway unreeling ahead of me in the headlights, ordinary and familiar and completely, utterly wrong, and I understood that something was happening that I did not have a category for. At 10:14 p.m., I passed mile marker 312 for the 5th time. I had been counting. I had been watching. I had seen the numbers climb past 340, past 350, past 360, and then without transition, without any perceptible gap or change in the road itself, 312 was in my headlights and the doe was on the shoulder and the CB was playing Waylon Jennings and my thermos was full and hot and my fuel gauge was at 7/8, exactly where it had been when this started. I pulled over again. I picked up my personal cell, tried a call to my dispatcher in Billings. The call failed. Tried a text. The message sat in the outgoing queue, undelivered. I tried Cass's number, for no logical reason other than that she was the person I most wanted to hear at that moment, and the call failed the same way. I sat with the phone in my hand and I looked at the thermos and I looked at the fuel gauge and I did the math. If the fuel gauge was accurate, and I had no reason to believe it wasn't, the truck had no history of gauge issues. I had used less than a quarter tank of fuel since leaving Billings. A quarter tank on a Kenworth T680 carrying a full load on flat highway at 62 miles per hour represents somewhere between 90 and 110 miles. The distance from Billings to mile marker 312 was approximately 11 miles. The numbers didn't reconcile. I thought about turning around. I sat with that thought for a while, testing it from different angles. The problem was that I had no evidence that west was any more accessible than east. If the road was doing what it appeared to be doing, looping, resetting, returning me to the same 40-something miles without my awareness, then direction might not matter at all. I might drive west for 4 hours and find myself back at mile marker 312 the same way I'd been finding it going east. I also thought about simply stopping and waiting for dawn, or for another vehicle, but the highway had been empty in both directions for over 2 hours, which was unusual even for that corridor at night in November, and something about the quality of the emptiness made me reluctant to sit still in it. Movement felt safer than stillness. I couldn't have explained why. It was instinctive, the way certain fears are instinctive, not learned but inherited, written into something older than thought. I started driving east again. The next loop, if loop is even the right word for it, lasted approximately 53 minutes by the clock, and I used the phrase by the clock deliberately because I had begun to distrust the clock the same way I was distrusting the fuel gauge and the thermos, all of these instruments that were supposed to be anchoring me to objective reality and were instead accumulating evidence for something I had no framework to understand. During those 53 minutes the road was unremarkable, flat, straight, the occasional overpass, the mile markers climbing in sequence, but the emptiness of it deepened. No oncoming headlights. No eastbound traffic appearing behind me in the mirrors. No infrastructure lights from any of the small towns that should have been appearing along that corridor. No glow from Forsyth, nothing from Hysham, none of the isolated yard lights that dot the ranches along that stretch like earthbound stars. Just the road and my headlights and the darkness pressing in from both sides, and the CB playing songs I didn't recognize anymore, the Wayland track gone, replaced by something older and slower and increasingly difficult to make out through the static. At 11:09 p.m., I noticed the fog. It came from the south, off the fields, low and fast the way radiation fog moves on cold nights when the ground temperature drops fast. Within 10 minutes it had covered the road to a depth of about 3 feet, and I reduced my speed to 50 and turned on the fog lights. The fog changed the quality of the darkness significantly. It diffused my headlights, shortened my sight line, made the reflective mile markers appear suddenly rather than emerging gradually from the distance. And it changed the sound of the drive, the way fog always does, muffling the road noise, making the cab feel more enclosed, more isolated, more like the inside of something than the outside. It was in the fog that I saw the other truck. It was eastbound, ahead of me, running at what appeared to be approximately the same speed I was, just at the edge of my sight line in the diffused headlights. A semi, dark-colored, pulling what looked like a standard dry van trailer. It appeared and disappeared in the fog in a way that was plausible. Thick patches, thin patches, but it never got closer and never fell further behind, maintaining that precise edge of visibility distance with an accuracy that felt, after a few minutes of watching it, less like coincidence and more like intention. I pushed the speed up to 65. The truck ahead did not appear to grow closer. I dropped back to 55. It did not appear to fall back. It simply existed at the limit of what I could see, moving the way I was moving, a dark shape in diffused light, the reflective tape on its trailer barely catching my beams. I picked up the CB. Eastbound semi ahead of me. You running 90 east? What's your handle? Static. The old sad music, barely audible. No response. I held my speed and watched the truck and tried to decide what I was looking at. It was possible it was a real driver who either didn't run a CB or had it turned off. Plenty of drivers ran without it, especially solo long-haul who'd gotten tired of the chatter. It was possible the fog was doing something to my distance perception and the truck was further ahead than it appeared. It was possible, I thought with a cold that had nothing to do with the temperature, that I was looking at myself. That thought arrived fully formed and I sat with it for a long time, because it was the kind of thought that, once arrived at, refuses to leave. I was driving a dark blue Kenworth T680 pulling a dry van. The truck ahead of me was a dark-colored semi pulling what appeared to be a dry van. The fog was limiting the detail I could make out. And I had been on this road, this same 40-mile section of road, for over 3 hours without making any progress east. If the road was looping, if I was somehow being returned to the start of a loop I couldn't perceive, then what was ahead of me might be a prior instance of my own passage, some residue of movement, some echo the road was keeping. I know how that sounds. I know. I'm not a man who thinks in those terms normally. I fix things when they're broken. I drive straight lines for a living. The closest I come to metaphysics on a regular basis is occasionally wondering if the universe gives a damn about any of us, which I generally conclude it does not, and finding that conclusion clarifying rather than depressing. But I was 3 hours into an 11-mile stretch of Montana interstate with a full thermos and a mysteriously emptying fuel tank and a truck ahead of me that was maintaining impossible distance. And at some point you run out of rational explanations and you start reaching for the ones that are available. At 11:47 p.m., the truck ahead of me stopped. It didn't brake, no taillights flared, it simply was moving and then was not, sitting on the shoulder with its running lights on, a dark shape in the fog, and I braked hard enough to feel the trailer shift slightly, bringing the Kenworth down to a crawl and then to a stop on the shoulder perhaps 200 feet behind it. I sat there for a full minute, engine at idle, watching the truck's running lights through the fog. Orange and amber, the standard array. No movement. No one emerging from the cab. I should have kept driving. I know that now. I knew it then. Some part of me knew it with the clarity that the body sometimes achieves when the mind is still working through the logic. But the other part of me, the part that had spent 11 miles becoming 3 hours, the part that wanted desperately for any of this to make contact with something recognizable, wanted to know what was in that truck. Needed to know. So I set the brake, took my flashlight from under the seat, and got out. The cold was worse than before, or it felt worse, the fog carrying a damp chill that penetrated differently than dry cold did. The highway was completely silent. No wind. No traffic. My footsteps on the asphalt were loud and deliberate in the stillness as I walked the shoulder toward the other truck, flashlight cutting through the fog in a beam that seemed to travel only a short distance before being absorbed. I could smell the exhaust from the idling engine, which meant the engine was running, which meant someone was in the cab. I came around to the driver's side and looked up at the door. The window was dark. I couldn't see inside. I knocked twice on the door with my knuckle, waited, heard nothing. I reached up and tried the door handle. It opened. The cab was empty. Engine running, heat on, CB crackling softly on the dash. A coffee thermos in the cup holder, same size as mine. A bag of orange candy on the passenger seat. I stood on the step and I looked at those things, and I felt the fear arrive at the animal level, the level below thought, the level that makes you want to move before your mind has finished processing why. I stepped back down to the shoulder and I looked at the front of the truck and my flashlight beam caught the hood, the dark blue paint, and the registration sticker on the windshield. And though I couldn't make out the plate from where I was standing, I didn't need to, because I recognized the dent in the lower corner of the passenger side bumper, a dent I'd put there backing into a loading dock in Spokane in March of 2018. And I recognized the faded ace of spades that Cassie had stuck to the bottom corner of the passenger window 3 years ago because she'd been going through a cards phase and wanted my truck to be lucky. I was looking at my own truck. I stepped back. Then again. Then I was walking fast, not running, because running felt like crossing a line, and I got back to my own cab and climbed in and sat behind the wheel and looked in the mirror at the other truck's running lights, 200 feet back, and I sat very still and breathed very carefully and tried to find any foothold in reality that was still solid. The CB crackled. The old sad music. And then, under it, something else, a voice, not a station bleed, not a radio voice, but a voice that was familiar in a way that reached below recognition into something more fundamental. My own voice, flat and muffled as if heard through a wall, saying, "Any eastbound traffic on I-90 east of Billings, you copy." I put the truck in gear and I drove. I don't know for how long. I stopped looking at the clock. I stopped looking at the fuel gauge. I kept my eyes on the mile markers and I watched them climb. 315, 322, 331, 340, 349. Past numbers I hadn't reached in all the hours of looping, and I kept going, and the fog thinned, and somewhere around what I believe was marker 362 the first hint of something appeared on the southern horizon. A faint, distant glow. Amber-colored. small but present. A yard light. A ranch. Something real and fixed, and outside the corridor I'd been trapped in, and I fixed my eyes on it and drove toward it and did not look away. Mile marker 371. Mile marker 380. The glow on the horizon joined by another to the north. Small lights, ranch infrastructure, the human imposition on the landscape that I had never in my life been so grateful to see. The fog was gone entirely. The CB was static only, the old music gone, Wayland gone, nothing but clean white noise. My fuel gauge read below a quarter tank. At what the clock told me was 6:52 a.m., though the sky was still dark and would be for another hour at that latitude in November. I passed a road sign indicating 17 miles to Forsyth, Montana, and I pulled into the eastbound rest area just past it and set the brake and turned off the engine and sat in the sudden silence for a very long time. Dispatch called at 7:15. I was 40 minutes behind schedule and they wanted an ETA. I gave them one. I did not explain why I was behind schedule. There is no version of the explanation that ends with me keeping my license and my route. I delivered the load to Rapid City at 11:40 a.m., 2 hours and 40 minutes late, paid for the delay out of my own percentage, and drove the empty truck back toward Billings that evening on I-90 heading west. I passed mile marker 312 at dusk, going 62 miles per hour, and I did not slow down, and the doe was still on the shoulder. Still there, after all those hours, which meant less than a day had passed in the world's reckoning even though I had lived 11 hours in 40 miles. The doe, and the tilted marker, and the ravens, and I drove past them and watched them disappear in my mirrors, and I kept going west toward Billings and toward Cass's next weekend and toward the life that was still, somehow, continuing. I've run I-90 east of Billings twice since then. Both times in daylight. Both times without incident. The road is what it always was, flat, long, brutally beautiful in the way that eastern Montana is beautiful, which is to say it does not ask for your approval or offer any comfort. It simply exists at a scale that makes your existence feel appropriately small. Mile marker 312 is there. The doe is gone, of course. She's been gone since that spring, cleaned up by the highway crew or finished by the ravens and the coyotes. The marker stands straight now, which means someone hit it and it was replaced. I have no explanation for what happened. I've looked, in the way that a practical man looks, asking other drivers, searching regional trucker forums, looking for any history of anomalous reports in that corridor. I found two. One from 1994, a trucker who reported losing 6 hours between Billings and Forsyth and waking up parked on the shoulder with no memory of stopping. One from 2011, a highway patrol officer who filed a report, later annotated as likely equipment failure, about his odometer failing to advance for what his clock said was 4 hours while he was running stationary patrol on that stretch. These are thin threads. They don't form a pattern I can prove. But they are there. What I keep returning to, in the quiet hours, is the truck. My truck, parked on the shoulder, engine running, empty cab, the orange candy on the passenger seat. I've spent a lot of time trying to find a framework for it that allows me to remain a rational person, and the closest I've been able to get is this. That road, that corridor, whatever it is or whatever lives in it or whatever it becomes at night in November, had been keeping something. A record. A looped impression of every passage, every driver who'd run those 40 miles and left some trace of themselves on the asphalt, on the air, on whatever medium the dark uses to hold what it collects. And I'd been driving through those layers all night without knowing it, passing through echoes of other trips, other nights, and at some point one of those echoes was mine, an earlier passage, weeks or months before, me and my truck and my coffee and Cass's candy, and the road had been running it on repeat the way the CB ran old songs on repeat, not knowing or caring whether anyone was listening. That's the closest I can get. It's not close enough. I know that. I called Cassie the morning after, from the truck stop in Rapid City. Didn't tell her what happened. Told her I'd missed the Hardin stop, but I had her candy and I'd see her next weekend. She sent back the horse emojis again. I looked at them for a long time, those small orange horses on the screen, and I thought about how they meant she was fine and the world was still running the way it was supposed to run, and I put the phone away and drank my coffee and started thinking about the drive home. Some roads remember you. I don't know what they do with what they remember. I don't know if the 11 hours I spent in those 40 miles are still there somewhere, preserved in whatever the dark keeps, a recording of me talking to empty static and driving toward a truck that was myself. I don't know if something was watching, or if I wandered into something that was indifferent to my presence the way the land itself is indifferent. Vast and old and running on rules I don't have the instruments to measure. I replaced the orange candy. Found the same brand at a gas station outside of Hardin on my next westbound run. Bought 2 bags, left one in the cup holder for Cassie. Kept the other one unopened in the door pocket, which is where it still is. I don't know why. Some instinct. Something that feels like leaving an offering, though I couldn't tell you to what, or why candy, or whether it matters at all. The road east of Billings doesn't answer questions. It just runs flat and straight into the dark, and the mile markers count up the way they're supposed to, and if you're lucky, they keep counting. If you're lucky, they don't bring you back. Like and subscribe my channel for more real stories.